The afternoon sun blazed down on Buckingham Palace's forecourt, turning the iron railings into heated lines of defense between tradition and the curious eyes of tourists. A quiet tension hung in the air, the kind that makes you wonder if something's about to happen. And then it did. A single tourist, bolder than the rest, leaned over the rope line. With a grin that said he knew better, he reached out and did the one thing every sign and every guide had warned against. He grabbed the royal guard's arm. The crowd gasped. Phones lifted in unison. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, some hoping for a reaction, others too stunned to speak. But what came next silenced them all. Think a royal guard is just for show? Think again. What happened that afternoon wasn't just a breach of protocol. It was a lesson in respect, discipline, and why some traditions are meant to be honored. Now, before we reveal the full story, first, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The afternoon sun baked the black iron railings of Buckingham Palace until they were too hot to touch. A steady hum of tourist chatter filled the air, a mix of languages and accents converging on the forecourt like a restless tide. Some leaned forward with cameras, hoping to catch the perfect shot of the stoic soldiers in their scarlet tunics, while others laughed nervously at their own jokes, testing the boundaries of tradition with cheeky questions. Lance Corporal Daniel Hughes stood motionless near the main gates, his bearskin cap adding an imposing height that turned heads even from a distance. Beneath the tall hat, sweat trickled down his temples, but he gave no sign of discomfort. Years of training had taught him how to endure the heat, the noise, the insistent curiosity of the crowd that gathered day after day to see men like him stand guard. The ceremonial uniform was immaculate, scarlet tunic crisp and heavy in the summer air, gold buttons catching stray beams of sunlight, the white leather belt bleached to a brightness that almost hurt the eyes. His gloved hands rested at his sides, fingers slightly curved, still as marble. Every inch of him had been drilled into perfection, the posture, the measured breathing, the unblinking stare that seemed to look through rather than at the crowds. But Daniel was more than the uniform. Beneath the polished exterior lived a man who'd known a different kind of discipline once, one forged not in ceremonial drill, but in the unforgiving dust of Afghanistan. He'd been there during the long months of convoys and compound clearances, when every shadow could hide an IED and every smile might mask a threat. He still carried the memory of Private Markel, his friend who never made it home, whose laugh Daniel could hear in the quietest hours if he let himself. Now he wore the red, just as Markel had hoped to one day. Each button fastened to perfection, each thread a testament to a tradition that stretched back centuries. Yet Daniel never forgot that beneath the show of ceremony was a code that demanded respect, both from the soldier and from those who came to watch. The crowd shifted and swelled with the changing of the guard, their excitement building as the ceremonial rotation began. Children balanced on parents' shoulders, phones held high to capture every movement. Somewhere in the background, a tour guide droned on about history, pointing at statues and recounting stories that had been told 1,000 times before. Daniel remained unmoved, his eyes fixed on the invisible horizon that all guards learned to find, that place where neither tourist nor camera can intrude. He felt the press of the crowd, but did not acknowledge it. He heard the laughter, but did not flinch. Yet beneath the surface, he was always alert, always prepared for the moment when admiration crossed the line into provocation. It happened more often than people realized, someone testing the boundaries, pressing too close, reaching out a hand that should have stayed behind the rope. He could feel that tension in the air now, a shift in the rhythm of the crowd, an undercurrent that prickled the back of his neck. Someone was about to cross a line. He'd seen it before, the hush before a storm, the pause that lasted just a heartbeat too long. And in that pause, Daniel's discipline held, because here, more than anywhere else, was where centuries of tradition demanded respect, and he was its guardian, whether the crowd realized it or not. The afternoon heat seemed to gather beneath the black railings, pooling on the forecourt like an unwelcome guest. The scent of sunscreen and street food mixed with the scent of iron and stone. Somewhere in the background, a street performer's faint guitar chords blended with the tourist chatter, but Daniel Hughes heard none of it. His training demanded focus, a stillness that went beyond muscle and bone, a discipline that reached into the core of a man and demanded he be more than just a uniform. He had learned that lesson the hard way, first in the heat of Kandahar, where every footstep could mean the end, and now in the press of the crowd outside Buckingham Palace, where every tourist seemed determined to test the lines drawn by centuries of tradition. It began like it always did, a small group of tourists, half a dozen maybe, young and brimming with the confidence that comes from too many likes on social media. They wore cargo shorts and branded t-shirts, sunglasses perched on their heads like trophies. Phones at the ready, they moved with the swagger of people convinced the world existed to be documented, not respected. At their center stood a tall, lanky man with a loud voice that carried even in the summer air. His laughter cut through the low hum of the crowd like a blade. "Bet you can't even blink, can you, mate?" he called, his accent thick with bravado. "What's the matter? Lost your tongue?" His friends hooted, their laughter bouncing off the old stones and drawing curious glances from passers-by. Cameras lifted, eager to catch the moment when the stoic guard might react. Daniel's eyes remained fixed forward, the invisible horizon unbroken. His heart, however, drummed a steady rhythm of caution. He'd seen this before, how laughter could curdle into disrespect, how a single step too close could turn a game into something else entirely. The leader of the group stepped closer, breaking the line that separated the ceremonial from the crowd. His grin widened as he drew within feet of Daniel's position, phone held high. "Look at this, boys, our own personal Buckingham statue. Wonder what happens if I wave at him." He waved theatrically, his hand slicing the air inches from Daniel's face. No reaction, no flinch, just the unwavering line of duty. A memory flickered through Daniel's mind, Markel's grin in the desert sun saying, "Sometimes you've got to let them talk. Don't mean you've got to answer." But the laughter around him grew bolder, the jeering louder. One of the other tourists, shorter, with a camera strap slung around his neck, called out, "Bet he's got a switch on the back that makes him talk. Someone try it." The leader took that as a challenge. With exaggerated caution, he extended a single finger toward Daniel's bearskin cap, pretending to poke an imaginary button. His friends cackled, recording every second. Daniel's jaw tightened under the hat's shadow. He had trained for this, to endure, to remain immovable. But each taunt chipped at the ceremony he represented, the discipline he'd spent years forging. The guide's voice, tired but polite, drifted through the laughter. "Please remain behind the barrier, sir. These soldiers are here to serve the crown, not as entertainment." The leader waved the guide off with a dismissive flick. "Relax, lady. We're just having a laugh." He turned back to Daniel. "What happens if I—" He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he reached across the rope line in a single, swift motion and wrapped his fingers around Daniel's right forearm. The contact was sudden, jarring. A hush fell over the immediate area, as if the air itself had been sucked away. The laughter died, replaced by a ripple of disbelief that spread through the crowd like a wave. Time seemed to stretch thin. Daniel felt the grip, firm but unsure, like a challenge and a plea all at once. In that instant, every part of his training, every memory of service and sacrifice, funneled into a single choice. His pulse steadied, his breathing slowed. Duty, after all, was more than a uniform. It was the promise that no hand, no matter how well-intentioned or careless, would ever strip the honor from the traditions he'd sworn to uphold. And this young man, laughing one moment, uncertain the next, was about to learn why that promise was never meant to be broken. Time seemed to slow, as Daniel Hughes felt the fingers tighten around his forearm, a jarring violation of the centuries-old line that separated the ceremonial from the crowd. The sun overhead seemed to freeze, its heat turning sharp, the weight of tradition pressing down on him like an anvil. In that single instant, Daniel felt every year of training, every moment of duty, every story of those who had stood before him converge into a singular resolve. For a fraction of a second, the guard's discipline held him rooted in place, his posture unwavering. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, the point beyond the crowd where every guard learned to rest his gaze, a place that seemed to hold every lesson about patience and endurance. But beneath the surface, his mind worked quickly, analyzing the breach of protocol, the risk of escalation, and the need to uphold the dignity of the uniform. The crowd around him had gone utterly still, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the forecourt. The laughter that had filled the space a moment earlier had vanished, replaced by a hush so deep that Daniel could hear the faint cry of a gull from somewhere beyond the palace gates. Phones trembled in uncertain hands, screens capturing every frame of this unexpected moment, eyes wide with anticipation. The young man holding his arm, mid-20s, sunburnt, with that loud, brash confidence that only youth and ignorance can muster, looked up at Daniel with a grin that had started to slip. His fingers clutched the bright white of Daniel's glove, as if testing whether the guard was human or just another part of the pageantry. "Come on, mate," he said, his voice a strained mix of bravado and disbelief. "Say something. It's all just for show, innit?" But Daniel Hughes was not just for show. His training rose to the surface like a tide, clear, precise, unwavering. In one measured motion, he shifted his weight forward, his boots hitting the forecourt stones, with a sharp, deliberate strike that echoed in the stillness. The movement was small but powerful, a subtle reminder that this uniform was not to be taken lightly. In that same motion, Daniel lifted his head, his eyes, blue and sharp beneath the shadow of his bearskin cap, locking onto the tourist's face. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken history, with the weight of generations who had stood guard in times of war and peace. In a voice low, but carrying enough to reach every ear in the immediate crowd, Daniel spoke. "Sir, remove your hand from my arm." The words fell like a stone into a still pond, sending ripples through the tourists, the bystanders, the phones held high in trembling hands. A collective gasp seemed to rise and hang in the air. The young man's eyes widened, his grin vanishing as quickly as it had come. "What?" he stammered, voice suddenly small. "I was just... remove your hand." Daniel's voice did not rise. It did not need to. Each word carried the authority of every soldier who had stood in that uniform before him, every oath sworn in the cold light of dawn, every moment of silent endurance. The man's fingers loosened, trembling now, and fell away from Daniel's arm. He took an uncertain step back, his eyes darting between his friends, who stood frozen, their phones still raised but no longer recording. Their faces had shifted from laughter to something close to shame. Daniel's eyes remained locked on the young man's, unwavering. "You have crossed a line," he said, his tone measured but carrying the weight of centuries. "This uniform is not a costume. It represents every man and woman who has stood for this country, every sacrifice, every tradition, every life given in its defense." The young man opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came. His friends stared, silent now, their earlier bravado dissolved in the face of something they did not understand, but instinctively respected. Around them, the crowd shifted. A mother pulled her child a little closer. An elderly man lowered his phone and placed his hand over his heart. A teenage girl, eyes wide, whispered. He spoke. Daniel drew a breath, steady and calm. "We stand here day after day, not for your amusement, but as a living testament to those who have fallen, and to those who serve still. Do not..." He paused, the words deliberate, each one sharp as a ceremonial blade. "Do not mistake our silence for permission." A hush deeper than any the forecourt had known settled over the crowd. It was as if even the traffic beyond the gates had stopped, as if the city itself recognized the significance of the moment. Daniel took a step back to his ceremonial position, his movements precise, his boots clicking against the stone, his white-gloved hands returned to his sides, his eyes lifted to the horizon. Still as a statue once more, but now the crowd saw the man inside the uniform. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, phones were lowered, heads bowed. A child's small voice whispered, "Daddy, he's a hero." And in that single perfect instant, the guard's silence spoke louder than any words could have. Daniel stood at his post, his breathing even, eyes fixed on the horizon. The white-gloved hand that had just demanded respect now rested at his side, as still as the scarlet fabric draping his arms. The crowd's hush lingered like a morning mist, broken only by the occasional shuffle of feet and the hushed whispers that always follow a moment too real for selfies. He felt the heat of the day more acutely now, the weight of the bearskin cap pressing down like a crown of duty. Sweat tickled the back of his neck, but he remained motionless, the embodiment of ceremonial discipline. Yet inside, his thoughts churned with the echoes of a different sun, a harsher one that had baked the dust of Kandahar into every crease of his uniform. The memory struck with the force of an old, familiar ache, the smell of sand and diesel, the metallic taste of fear that clung to the back of his throat. He saw Private Markel crouched beside him, their patrol halted by a suspicious shape in the road, a piece of scrap metal or a deadly device. Markel had been the one to laugh, even as sweat stung their eyes. "Hughes," he'd said, "it's not about looking tough. It's about standing your ground so the others can keep moving." That was Markel, always the one to crack a grin under fire, always the one to make the worst situations seem bearable. And when the convoy moved again, slow, careful, every nerve on edge, it was Markel who caught the blast. One moment he was there, the next he was gone. Daniel had carried that silence with him ever since. Through the training drills, the endless hours of ceremonial parade, the heavy weight of the uniform. Every time he stepped onto the forecourt, he felt Markel's ghost at his shoulder, reminding him that standing still wasn't just about tradition. It was about holding the line for those who couldn't stand anymore. A ripple of movement at the rope line brought Daniel back to the present. The young man who had grabbed his arm now stood with his head lowered, the bravado gone from his shoulders. His friends hung back, the glow of their phone screens now cold and uncertain in their hands. The young man's voice trembled as he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said. It wasn't loud, but it carried in the hush. I didn't know it meant that much." Daniel didn't speak. His silence was answer enough, but his eyes shifted slightly, acknowledging the apology without softening. He couldn't afford to let his guard drop too far. Tradition demanded that he remain the stoic figure, the one who carried the weight of the uniform with unwavering dignity. Just then, a figure stepped forward, a man in his 70s, maybe older, his posture still proud despite the years. He wore a modest lapel pin that caught the light, a small poppy with a service ribbon folded beneath. His eyes, sharp and gray, met Daniel's with a quiet understanding that needed no words. The man paused just outside the rope line, and in that simple pause, Daniel felt the weight of every story, every sacrifice, every uniformed man and woman who had stood watch in far more dangerous places than a London courtyard. The man didn't speak, but he offered the smallest nod, a gesture that said, "I see you. I see what you carry." And in that nod, Daniel felt a bridge built between generations, between the dust of Kandahar and the stone of Buckingham Palace, between the living and the memory of the fallen. The crowd, once a restless sea of noise, had transformed into a congregation of witnesses. Their eyes no longer searched for spectacle, but settled into a reverence that needed no explanation. A mother clutched her child's hand a little tighter. A teenage boy lowered his phone and swallowed hard, his cheeks flushed with the understanding that some lines weren't meant to be crossed. Daniel's gaze remained forward, but inside, he felt a quiet strength settle into his chest. It wasn't the pride of a man who had won a contest. It was the calm of a soldier who knew he'd done his duty. He wasn't seeking applause. He wasn't seeking validation. He stood for something larger than himself, something built on the backs of those who had come before. In that moment, Daniel understood why Markel had laughed that day in the dust. It wasn't defiance. It was courage. It was the knowledge that sometimes silence wasn't enough, and that when the time came to speak, to move, to remind the world of the sacrifices behind the uniform, it had to be done with the same quiet dignity that marked every day on duty. He could feel the weight of the ceremonial cap on his head, heavy with history. The scarlet tunic on his shoulders, warm in the sun, a burden and an honor all at once. The memory of Afghanistan faded into the rhythm of the present. The slight breeze that shifted the flags above the gates, the rustle of the crowd as they tried to process what they had witnessed. And through it all, Daniel stood, the line unbroken, the lesson clear. Some traditions are more than pageantry. Some uniforms carry more than ceremony. And sometimes a single voice, calm, measured, resolute, is all it takes to remind the world why we stand the way we do. The hush that had settled over the forecourt now felt like a living thing, heavy, almost tangible. Daniel Hughes remained at his post, his eyes trained on the invisible horizon, posture impeccable, the bright scarlet tunic almost glowing in the late afternoon sun. But something had shifted, both in him and in the crowd. A quiet murmur rose among the tourists as they processed what had just happened. Where laughter and jeering had once ruled the air, Now there was a cautious respect, a newfound understanding of the line that should never have been crossed. A tour guide, her uniform crisp and her hair neatly pulled back, approached the group of young men who'd moments earlier been so loud. Her voice was gentle but carried the authority of someone who'd seen enough crowds to know when a lesson had been learned. "Gentlemen," she said softly, "please step back behind the rope." The young man who'd grabbed Daniel's arm nodded quickly, eyes lowered. His face, flushed with embarrassment, showed no trace of the grin that had once dared the stoic guard to break. His friends moved with him, their phones now lowered, as if even they understood that some moments weren't meant for recording. The guide offered Daniel a small nod of gratitude, a silent acknowledgement that he had handled the situation with a dignity that no lecture could have matched. Daniel's boots clicked softly as he shifted back into his ceremonial stance, his posture once again the embodiment of discipline. But to those watching closely, something had changed. His presence seemed to radiate a quiet strength that went beyond the uniform, a strength forged in desert sands and on parade grounds alike. Across the rope line, the crowd had gathered closer, but their expressions were different now. Mothers held their children's hands a little tighter. Teenagers who'd once been jostling for the best view now stood with their heads bowed slightly, as if paying respects. A small girl, no more than 7, squeezed between her parents and peered up at Daniel with wide, solemn eyes. She wore a little pink backpack decorated with cartoon animals, and her hair was gathered in 2 neat braids. She hesitated for a moment, then lifted her small hand in a shy, wobbly salute. For a single heartbeat, Daniel's eyes softened, just enough for her to know she'd been seen. His head didn't move, his posture remained impeccable, but the shift in his gaze was enough to make the little girl beam. She turned to her mother with a look of wonder. "Mummy, he saw me." Nearby, an elderly man wearing a worn regimental tie stood with his hand over his heart. His hair, thin and silver, caught the light as he watched Daniel with the kind of respect that could only come from someone who'd worn a uniform himself. He didn't speak, but the gesture alone spoke volumes, an unspoken salute from one generation to another. No applause broke the stillness, no cheers. The crowd didn't need them. What had happened transcended spectacle. It had become something more profound, something that didn't require noise to be felt. From the corner of his vision, Daniel saw his sergeant approach, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose years of service had etched lines into his face that no parade gloss could hide. The sergeant's uniform was as immaculate as Daniel's, his ceremonial sword gleaming in the sun. The sergeant paused beside Daniel, eyes scanning the crowd before settling on his subordinate. With a small, almost imperceptible nod, he acknowledged what Daniel had done, held the line, honored the tradition, and reminded the world why the uniform mattered. The nod wasn't much to an outsider, but to Daniel it carried the weight of every fallen comrade, every sleepless night, every moment of silent endurance. He stood taller, if that was even possible, the heat on his face no longer a burden, but a badge of honor. Slowly the crowd began to disperse. Tourists drifted away in clusters, their conversations hushed, their expressions thoughtful. Some glanced back over their shoulders at Daniel, eyes lingering with a respect that hadn't been there before. Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders, not for a better view, but perhaps to whisper a quiet explanation of why that soldier stood so still, why he didn't react the way they'd expected. Daniel remained as he had from the beginning, silent, dignified, the living embodiment of the sacrifice and tradition he represented. But now he carried with him not just the memory of his fallen friend, but the weight of every lesson he'd ever learned. That respect isn't given. It's earned. In the final moments before the ceremonial shift change, Daniel's gaze swept the horizon one last time, taking in the fading sunlight, the gentle rustle of the flags above the gates, the quiet transformation of the crowd. When the relief guard finally marched forward in perfect formation, Daniel executed his ceremonial steps with the same precision he'd shown every day since earning his place here. His movements were sharp, his head held high, his boots striking the stone with crisp finality. As he passed through the gates and into the palace's cool shade, he felt the weight of the uniform settle on his shoulders like a second skin, heavy but welcome. He didn't need applause. He didn't need thanks. He didn't need applause. He didn't need thanks. All he needed was the knowledge that, for one afternoon, he'd reminded the world that behind the uniform stood a man, one who carried the honor of generations past and the unwavering commitment to stand, even when silence was the hardest response of all. Would you have respected the guard's silence, or would you have tried to provoke him too? And what do you think? Do traditions like this still matter today, or are they outdated? Drop your answers in the comments below. We read every single one and love hearing what you think. If you found this story powerful, give it a like and share it with someone who might need a reminder that respect is earned through patience, discipline, and the quiet strength of those who stand their ground. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you never miss a single story. Every day we bring you real tales about the human beings behind the red tunic and tall bearskin hat. And if you know someone who thinks royal guards are just for show, send them this video. They might just change their mind. Check out our other stories on screen now. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with another story that shows why these traditions still matter.